The roar begins before the gates open. Tens of thousands of voices surge into one, a thunder that rattles the marble bones of the Colosseum. Dust swirls in the shafts of sunlight that pour through the awnings, and the smell of sweat, oil, and blood is already heavy in the air. Rome has gathered for its favorite ritual, to watch men stand on the edge of life and death and decide which side they will fall to. For the crowd, this is entertainment. For the men waiting in the tunnels below, it is something else entirely. A torch sputters against the damp stone. Shadows bend across faces, some scarred from a dozen contests, others smooth with the trembling fear of their first. These are the gladiators of Rome, slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, and sometimes free men who have chosen this path for reasons only they can name. In the silence between the crowd's roars, you can hear the sound of men whispering prayers, striking their weapons against the walls, or simply breathing, as if every breath might be their last. Above their heads, the announcer calls out names that echo like thunder. Each one carries weight. Some names spark wild cheers, others sharp intakes of breath. Because here in Rome, a gladiator's name could be greater than a senator's, louder than a general's, more enduring than an emperor's. Their victories and their deaths are currency. But how does a man condemned to chains become a legend? How does a slave earn immortality? The answer lies not only in the sand of the arena, but in the stories Rome refused to forget. There were gladiators who lived only a few heartbeats in the amphitheater, and there were those whose names stretched across generations. Some were worshipped like heroes, carved into graffiti on tavern walls, painted on the plaster of villas, their likeness sold as crude figurines in the markets. Others were feared like demons, whispered about in barracks and brothels alike. Every gladiator carried a different fate, but they all shared the same truth. Once you stepped into the arena, you ceased to be merely a man. You became a spectacle, a myth in the making. Picture, for a moment, the silence just before the clash. The gate creaks. The sand crunches under leather sandals. Shields rise like iron moons. Two men stand across from one another, their breath hot in the Roman sun. One will walk away. The other will feed the dust. In that instant, the entire empire watches. Farmers from the provinces, merchants from the east, even the emperor himself, sitting in his cushioned seat, thumb poised to grant life or deny it. Gladiators were both disposable and divine, bodies meant to be broken, yet names meant to endure. Some gladiators chose to fight for survival. Others fought for freedom, and a rare few fought for glory alone, refusing escape even when it was offered, because the arena had already given them more than the outside world ever could. These are their stories. Men like Spartacus, who turned his back on the arena and led an army against Rome itself. Men like Flama, who refused freedom not once, but 4 times, because he belonged to the sand more than he did to peace. Men like Carpophorus, who could slay 20 beasts in a single day, as if the gods themselves had lent him their wrath. And men like Verus and Priscus, who fought one another to a standstill so perfect that even the emperor could not choose a victor. They were slaves, killers, rebels, champions. They were both hated and adored. And yet, all of them, no matter how different, left the same mark. Their scars did not fade with their flesh. Their stories outlived them. The arena gave them blood and pain, but in return, it gave them something far rarer, memory. The dust has long since settled. The Colosseum now lies in ruin, its stones gnawed by centuries of silence. But listen closely, and the echoes remain. In every broken arch, in every weathered step, you can still hear the voices. You can still see the sand darkened with blood. And if you close your eyes, you might hear them whisper their names. This is the world of Rome's most famous gladiators. Men who died as slaves but rose as legends. The names came first. Before a gladiator's face was known, before the scars on his arms or the blood on his sword. His name echoed through the streets of Rome. In taverns, in markets, even in whispered wagers behind temples, the names carried weight. They promised spectacle, victory, and sometimes tragedy. Rome lived on names, and in the arena, names could outlast empires. One such name was Spiculus. He was no ordinary slave tossed into the pit. He rose during the reign of Nero, the emperor who craved entertainment as much as he craved cruelty. Spiculus was the emperor's darling, the fighter who made the Colosseum roar louder than thunder. He fought with elegance, his sword strokes not just deadly, but mesmerizing, as if every movement had been rehearsed for the gods themselves. His victories were so overwhelming that Nero showered him with riches, villas, even slaves of his own, luxuries unheard of for a man who fought for his life in the sand. But Rome's affection was fickle. When Nero's own life crumbled in rebellion and fear, the emperor begged for Spiculus to deliver him a gladiator's death, swift, clean, and merciful. Yet Spiculus was not there. He could not be found. The emperor died at another's hand, abandoned, the very man he worshipped in the arena absent when he needed him most. Still, Spiculus' name remained carved into memory, the gladiator who had been worth an emperor's last breath. If Spiculus was the emperor's jewel, another was the poet's dream, Hermes. To see Hermes fight was to watch an artist paint on a canvas of sand. Strong, graceful, and devastatingly precise, he was immortalized in verses written long after his blood had soaked the arena. Romans spoke of him not just as a killer, but as a wonder, a man whose body seemed shaped by divine hands for combat. Poets etched his glory into lines meant to last forever, ensuring that long after his bones were dust, his image would shimmer in words. The poets were not alone. The common people adored gladiators, sometimes with a fever that bordered on worship. Graffiti in Pompeii revealed their passions. Crude sketches of swordsmen, names scratched in haste, boasting of victories, longing for their return to the arena. Some gladiators became the idols of women who carved their names into walls, while others were envied by men who wagered fortunes on their triumphs. But fame was not always gilded. Some names lived only because they died spectacularly. Tetraites, remembered in carvings across the empire, was less celebrated for endless victories than for the sheer ferocity of his matches. He became a symbol not because he was untouchable, but because his fights were unforgettable. His image traveled far beyond Rome, scratched into pottery and painted into corners of homes, a testament to how the crowd loved blood and spectacle more than perfection. Fame could lift a man to heights unimaginable. It could also crush him beneath the weight of expectation. To be a gladiator was to live knowing that every fight might be your last, and that your legacy depended not on survival, but on how you died. Some leaned into it, making each swing of their blade a performance. Others feared it, knowing that no matter how many victories they achieved, one mistake would erase them forever. And always, behind the applause, there was fire. The fire of ambition, the fire of rebellion, the fire of desperation. For the gladiator's fame was not just his own. It belonged to the emperor who owned him, the lanista who trained him, the mob who demanded his suffering. Even in glory, chains rattled. The Colosseum was not a theater. It was a crucible. Fame and fire devoured men alike, shaping them into stories Rome would never forget. And yet, for every Spiculus and Hermes, there were those who sought something more dangerous than applause. They sought freedom. For most gladiators, the dream of freedom was a mirage shimmering beyond reach. Rome promised it with wooden swords, the rudis, a token of release, but rarely did it come. And even when it did, freedom was a complicated prize. What did it mean to walk out of the gates after years of killing for survival? To leave behind the roar of the crowd, the only life a man had come to know? The tension of that choice burned brightest in the story of Verus and Priscus. They were not sworn enemies, nor bitter rivals. They were brothers in the sand, men who had trained side by side, each sharpening the other until their skill glittered like steel. When the Colosseum was inaugurated under Emperor Titus, the spectacle demanded something extraordinary, and so Rome set these two men against one another. The crowd was ravenous. From the first clash of steel, it was clear this was no ordinary match. They fought with precision. Each move answered with a counter so perfect it was as if they shared a single mind. Blood ran down their arms, sweat stung their eyes, but neither gave ground. Minutes bled into hours, and still neither yielded. The people roared, enthralled by the impossible symmetry. And then came the twist Rome never expected. Exhausted, battered, their bodies failing, Verus and Priscus looked at one another and knew the truth. There could be no victor. They raised their weapons in unison, a silent pact of brotherhood before the emperor himself. The crowd gasped. This was not defiance. It was something stranger, rarer. It was dignity. Emperor Titus rose from his seat. His thumb hovered in the air, but instead of lowering it, he raised both arms high. In a gesture unseen before or since, he granted freedom to them both. The arena erupted. The impossible had happened. Two men had fought to the very edge of death, not for one to conquer, but for both to rise. Rome called them heroes. Yet beneath the cheers lingered a more dangerous idea, that in unity, gladiators could claim their own fate. Not every man sought freedom with such grace. Marcus Attilius was proof of that. Unlike most who entered the arena, he had not been condemned by chains. He was a free man, a Roman citizen, who chose to become a gladiator. His reasons were murky: debts, dishonor, perhaps a hunger for something only the sand could offer. What shocked Rome was not his choice, but his triumph. In his very first fight, Attilius defeated Hilarus, a champion who had fought 14 times. The crowd was stunned. A nobody, a volunteer, had toppled a seasoned veteran. And Attilius did not stop there. He kept winning, fight after fight, proving that even those who chose the arena could master it. He was not bound by chains, yet he embraced the blood, as if the sand itself called to him. His story forced Romans to confront an uncomfortable truth. The arena was not just punishment. It was a magnet. Some men found in it a twisted form of purpose, a place where death gave meaning to life. And yet, not all stories ended in freedom or victory. For many, the chains only tightened. The rudis was promised, but rarely delivered. More often, the choice was simple: kill or die, and leave your name in the dust. But whispers began to stir. If Verus and Priscus could defy the rules of the game, if a free man like Attilius could rise higher than veterans, then perhaps the sand was not only a stage. Perhaps it was a spark. Freedom was no longer a dream whispered in the tunnels. It was becoming something more dangerous, an idea. And ideas, Rome knew too well, could burn brighter than fire. The Colosseum was not the only crucible where men were tested. For some gladiators, the struggle was not against the man before them, but against the very empire that bound them. Fame had lifted Spiculus. Brotherhood had freed Verus and Priscus. But for others, freedom could not be given. It had to be seized, wrenched from Rome's iron grip with blood and fury. One such man was Flamma, a Syrian warrior taken in chains. The arena should have broken him, yet instead, it revealed the fire in his soul. Fight after fight, he triumphed, until the crowd adored him and the emperors themselves offered him the rudis, the wooden sword of freedom. And not once, but 4 separate times, he refused it. Why? People whispered. Why would a man who could be free choose to remain? Perhaps it was because the outside world held nothing for him anymore. Perhaps he had found a twisted kind of belonging in the sand, where every roar of the crowd was proof that he still lived. Or perhaps it was because the only freedom Flama recognized was the freedom to fight, and in that he was already free. Flama's defiance haunted Rome. He embodied a gladiator's paradox, chained, yet unbroken, offered life, yet choosing death again and again. His legend burned like a torch, reminding all who watched that glory could outweigh survival. But not every gladiator sought fire in the arena alone. Some carried it beyond the gates. Crixus was one of them. A Gaul captured and enslaved, he fought with a ferocity that terrified even seasoned veterans. In the arena, he was unstoppable, but his rage was never only for survival. It was for vengeance. Crixus hated Rome with every fiber of his being. Each victory was a blow against the empire that had shackled him. And then came the moment when rage and opportunity collided. In Capua, alongside a Thracian named Spartacus, Crixus broke free. Together with dozens of other gladiators, they smashed their way out of the ludus with kitchen knives and cleavers, seizing weapons, fleeing into the countryside. Rome laughed at first, a handful of slaves daring to defy the empire. But the laughter soon turned to fear. For Crixus and Spartacus were not merely fugitives. They became leaders of a rebellion that swelled to tens of thousands. Escaped slaves, desperate farmers, and even free men joined them, forming a ragged army that shook Rome to its core. Crixus commanded with fury. He longed not for compromise, not for survival, but for the destruction of Rome itself. Where Spartacus dreamed of leading his followers to freedom beyond Italy, Crixus burned for vengeance within it. Their bond, once forged in chains, began to strain under the weight of different visions. The rebellion spread like fire, and Rome trembled. Senators argued in panic. Generals were dispatched and defeated, and the streets whispered of slaves who fought like wolves. The name Gladiator no longer belonged to the arena alone. It had become a symbol of terror. Imagine, for a moment, the fear of a Roman citizen in those days. To wake in the night and wonder if tomorrow's dawn would bring news of victory or of slaughter. To realize that men once caged for entertainment now commanded armies. The spectacle had escaped its stage. But even in rebellion, the cost was unbearable. Crixus led a separate force of thousands, striking at Rome with savage precision. Yet the empire's armies eventually cornered him. Betrayed by the very land he fought upon, he and his men were cut down, their blood soaking the earth not in sand, but in fields. His fury ended in silence, but his name lingered, the gladiator who carried his chains into war and dared to shatter them in Rome's face. The rebellion would continue under Spartacus, and its shadow grew ever darker. But with Crixus' death, it became clear this was no mere uprising. It was a storm that would either free thousands or consume them all. The gladiator struggle had left the arena behind. Rome was no longer just a spectator. It was the opponent. And the greatest battle, the climax of their defiance, was yet to come. The rebellion had become a storm. From a band of runaway gladiators, Spartacus had forged an army, tens of thousands strong, men and women who no longer bowed to Rome. They marched across Italy like a shadow, burning estates, shattering armies, and turning the empire's arrogance into fear. For nearly 2 years, the Senate had underestimated them, but no longer. Now, Rome sent its legions. The fields of southern Italy trembled with the sound of war drums. Spartacus knew the reckoning had come. His followers looked to him not just as a leader, but as a symbol, the Thracian slave who had defied the world's greatest empire and made Rome bleed. Yet beneath his iron will, Spartacus carried a burden no one could see. He knew their rebellion could not last forever. Rome's reach was too vast, its legions too disciplined. Every victory had been borrowed time, and time was running out. On the eve of the final battle, Spartacus stood before his army. Torches flickered against the night. Faces stared at him, Gauls, Thracians, Germans, farmers, shepherds, all bound by desperation and hope. He raised his sword, the same one once thrust into his hand in the arena, and spoke words that were less command than confession. Brothers, we were born slaves. Rome gave us chains and called us less than men. But look at us now. We have broken their armies. We have made them fear our names. Whatever comes tomorrow, know this, we were free. Here, in this moment, no emperor can take that from us. The next dawn was red. Spartacus led from the front, as he always had. The clash was thunderous, Roman shields locking, slave warriors charging with a fury that shook the earth. Arrows darkened the sky. Spears pierced flesh. The screams of men and horses rose into chaos. Spartacus cut through the melee like fire through dry grass, his blade finding every gap in armor, his presence a rallying cry for those who still believed they could win. But the tide was merciless. Rome's legions pressed forward, disciplined and unyielding, their lines swallowing the rebels one by one. Spartacus' army shattered against the wall of shields, their courage no match for Rome's relentless machine. Yet still he fought. When his horse was slain beneath him, he rose to his feet, bloodied but unbroken. Surrounded, he carved a circle of corpses around himself, striking down centurions, shattering spears with sheer will. The Romans called out to capture him alive, but he refused capture. Every strike was defiance. Every breath was resistance. Witnesses said that even when pierced by spears, Spartacus fought on, dragging himself forward to reach the Roman general at the rear. His body was failing, but his spirit would not yield. He died on his feet, sword in hand, his eyes burning with the fire of a man who had refused to bow to the empire. When the dust settled, the fields were littered with bodies. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, a road lined with death stretching miles to the gates of Rome. The message was clear. This was the price of defiance. And yet, Rome could not erase him. Spartacus' body was never found. The man who had defied an empire became larger in death than he had ever been in life. His name passed into legend, not as a slave, not as a gladiator, but as a symbol. He had no crown, no throne, no empire. But he carried something greater, the eternal image of a man who chose freedom, even when it meant death. For centuries, children would whisper his name. Revolutions, yet unborn, would claim his spirit. And Rome, for all its cruelty, could never kill the idea he had unleashed. Spartacus was gone, but his rebellion had left a scar on the empire, and scars, like legends, never fade. The Colosseum still stands. Its arches rise against the Roman sky, broken yet unyielding, a skeleton of stone that has outlived empires. Tourists walk its corridors now, snapping photographs where once blood pooled in the sand. The roar of the crowd has fallen silent, but if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it again, a tide of voices, thunderous and hungry, demanding life or death. Time has stripped the arena of its purpose, yet it cannot erase the men who gave it meaning. Spiculus, adored by an emperor. Hermes, immortalized in poetry. Tetraites, remembered on walls far from Rome. Verus and Priscus, brothers in defiance who turned combat into dignity. Flamma, who chose chains over false freedom. Crixus, who carried his fury into war. And Spartacus, who turned rebellion into legend. They were not kings. They were not emperors. They held no office, wrote no laws, commanded no legions. They were slaves, prisoners, men cast aside by society. Yet it is their names, not those of many senators or generals, that endure. Rome wanted them to be expendable. Rome made them unforgettable. There is something unsettling in that truth. The gladiator was meant to be less than human, a spectacle, a disposable body thrown to the sand for entertainment. And yet, through pain and blood, he became more than human. He became myth. Perhaps that is why their stories linger, because in them we see a mirror. We see men stripped of choice, yet finding meaning in defiance. Men denied freedom, yet carving dignity in their final breaths. Men who understood that life is not measured in years, but in the fire you leave behind. Even now, their shadows cling to the Colosseum's walls. In the cracks of its stones, in the weathered steps where Romans once stamped their sandals, in the faint etchings of graffiti that still whisper names. The empire has fallen, but the echoes of its arenas remain. Listen closely, and you may hear it. The rasp of a sword dragged across a shield, the clash of steel, the intake of breath before a final strike. You may hear the crowd surge, a sea of voices rising as one. And beneath it all, the whisper of men who lived and died for spectacle, yet became eternal. Spartacus, Flamma, Verus, Priscus, Hermes, Spiculus. Their names still burn. The gladiators' world is gone, but the lesson remains. Power builds monuments. Memory builds legends. And sometimes it is the forgotten, the enslaved, the broken who outlive the empires that sought to crush them. 2,000 years later, the Colosseum stands as a ruin, but the men who bled within it have not vanished. They endure not in marble or gold, but in story. They endure because we cannot forget them, because part of us does not want to. And maybe that is the gladiator's true victory. Not survival, not freedom, but remembrance. For when the gates open in memory, the roar begins once more. And in that roar, the gladiators live again.